On the night of their fifth wedding anniversary, Daniel Carter placed a white envelope on the table between them and told his wife, in a voice stripped of anger, that their love had died a long time ago, and that ending things was the kindest thing left for either of them to do. Amara did not argue. She did not raise her voice or ask him to reconsider. She simply picked up the pen he offered and signed her name beneath his, her hand steady, in a way that unsettled him more than tears ever could have. It was only a few hours later, when a procession of black cars rolled through the gates of the Johnson estate, and dozens of executives bowed their heads and called her by a title he had never once heard her use, that Daniel understood. The woman he had just let go of was the wealthiest heiress in the country, and that he had spent 5 years married to a secret so large it could swallow a city whole. They had lived, for as long as Daniel could remember, inside a small apartment on the edge of Brooklyn, the kind of place with a radiator that clanked in winter and a window unit that struggled through July. Amara wore the same handful of sweaters in rotation, drove a car with over 100,000 miles on it, and never once suggested they deserved something finer. She packed her own lunches. She clipped coupons out of habit rather than necessity, or so Daniel believed, and she never spoke about money in any tone that suggested she thought about it at all. Daniel, meanwhile, worked himself thin at the architecture firm where he had spent a decade climbing one rung at a time, staying late over blueprints, taking on extra projects, certain that if he simply worked hard enough, the life they were building together would eventually feel secure. He loved her plainness. He loved that she never asked for more than what they had. Their evenings followed a rhythm Daniel had grown to treasure, without ever examining too closely. Amara would come home smelling faintly of espresso and cinnamon, kick off her worn sneakers by the door, and settle onto the second-hand couch, with her feet tucked beneath her, while he sketched building elevations at the kitchen table under a single lamp. They ate simple meals, pasta more nights than either of them liked to admit, and split the cost of everything down to the dollar, the way two people do when they have decided, together, that fairness matters more than comfort. Neighbors sometimes assumed they were newlyweds, still finding their footing, still saving towards something bigger, and Daniel never corrected them, because in his mind that was exactly what they were, two young professionals, building a modest life brick by careful brick, with nothing waiting behind them but hard work and hope. There was a particular tenderness in how little Amara asked for, and for years Daniel had mistaken that tenderness for simplicity rather than sacrifice. She never once glanced longingly at a storefront window the way other women he knew sometimes did. She never compared their apartment to a friend's larger one, never hinted that she wished for anything beyond what they already shared. He used to joke, in the early years, that he had married the only woman in the city immune to the pull of luxury, and she would laugh along with him, a soft, private laugh that he now understood carried far more weight than he had ever bothered to notice. But somewhere in the last year, small cracks had begun to show, and Daniel had started noticing them the way a man notices a hairline fracture in a wall he built himself. Amara would vanish for stretches of time, with no real explanation, gone for 2 days, sometimes 4, returning with tired eyes and a suitcase she unpacked in silence. Her phone rang constantly, at hours that made no sense, and she would step into the hallway or the bathroom to take the calls, her voice dropping too low for him to make out the words. She traveled more than any woman he knew who claimed to work at a coffee shop, and when he asked where she had been, she offered him soft, incomplete answers that trailed off before they reached anywhere useful. Daniel began to lie awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, turning the same question over and over in his mind, wondering when exactly the woman who used to tell him everything had become someone who told him nothing at all. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself this for months, the way people do when the alternative is too frightening to sit with. But there is only so long a man can watch his wife disappear into a life he is not invited into before he starts to draw his own conclusions. And the conclusion Daniel drew, quietly and painfully, was that she no longer loved him. He thought of the early years, when she used to leave notes on the mirror before he woke up, when she used to call just to hear his voice between errands. He thought of how none of that existed anymore, how what remained between them felt more like two people sharing an address than two people sharing a life. He confided in no one at first, carrying the suspicion privately the way a man carries a stone in his pocket, turning it over and over until its edges wear smooth against his palm. He watched Amara's face more closely than he ever had before, searching for some flicker of guilt or evasion, and found instead only exhaustion, a weariness that seemed to sit behind her eyes, even when she smiled at him across the kitchen table. Some nights he almost asked her directly, the question forming fully in his throat, only to swallow it back down at the last moment, afraid of what her answer might do to the fragile peace they still managed to keep between them. He told himself he was imagining things, that a marriage under strain could survive if he simply gave it enough patience, enough silence, enough of the same quiet endurance that had carried him through every difficult season of his life. But patience, he was learning, has a way of curdling into resentment when it is never rewarded with honesty, and by the time winter turned to spring, Daniel no longer recognized the hopeful certainty he once carried into that apartment every evening. And so, on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, Daniel Carter walked into a law office 3 blocks from his firm and, without telling a single soul, requested a full set of divorce papers. He remembered, in the weeks that followed, the way they had first met, because grief has a habit of dragging a person backward before it lets them move forward. She had been standing behind the counter of a small coffee shop near his old office, wearing an apron 2 sizes too large, laughing at something a coworker had said, and Daniel had ordered a black coffee, just to hear her voice ask his name. They fell in love the way people do in stories nobody quite believes until it happens to them, quickly, completely, without caution. Within a year they were married in a small restaurant, with folding chairs and second-hand candles, and Daniel remembered thinking, on that day, that he had never felt luckier in his life, because he had found a woman who wanted nothing from him but his company. Those first months together had felt almost impossibly easy, the two of them staying up late over cheap takeout, talking about buildings Daniel wanted to design. Someday and small dreams Amara described, with a wistfulness he mistook for simple modesty, rather than genuine longing for an ordinary life she had never been allowed to have. She asked him questions about his family, his childhood, the little row house he grew up in with 2 working parents who never had much but always had enough, and she listened to every answer with an intensity that felt, even then, like she was studying something she desperately wanted to understand from the inside. He never once suspected that the woman falling asleep against his shoulder on the subway home had grown up choosing between guarded estates and boarding schools, because nothing in the way she carried herself hinted at anything beyond the modest, unremarkable life she claimed as her own. In the years that followed, Amara turned down every extravagance he half-jokingly offered. When he mentioned, after a good bonus, that they might look at a bigger apartment, she shook her head and said their place was enough. When a friend suggested a vacation to somewhere warm and expensive, she found reasons to postpone it, again and again, until the subject quietly died. Daniel assumed, as anyone in his position might, that she came from very little, that frugality was simply woven into her, and he respected her for it, even admired her for it, because it made her feel like the one steady thing in a world obsessed with more. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that her refusals had nothing to do with scarcity and everything to do with fear. The fear that the moment money entered their marriage, he would begin to see her differently, the way so many people had before him. It was in the final months that the strangeness sharpened into something Daniel could not explain away. He began seeing a car, sleek and dark, waiting near the corner 2 blocks from their apartment, always at odd hours, always gone by the time he got close enough to see who sat inside. Amara would walk the rest of the way home on foot, claiming she preferred the air, claiming the car belonged to a coworker, giving her a ride from a meeting that ran late. Daniel watched from their window sometimes, unable to help himself, catching only the gleam of tinted glass and the quiet, practiced way she stepped out before it ever reached their block. He never saw a face. He never saw a name. All he saw was distance growing between them, one unexplained evening at a time, and a suspicion that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with betrayal. He decided to try one more time before he did anything he could not undo, and so he spent an entire Saturday preparing their anniversary dinner himself, the way he used to when they were newly married, and money was tighter, and effort was the only gift he could afford. He set the table with the same white candles from their wedding, saved all these years in the back of a drawer, and he told himself that if she came home and saw the effort, something between them might soften. But the hour came and went, and then another, and Amara arrived nearly 2 hours late, her phone buzzing against the counter before she had even taken off her coat. She apologized, genuinely it seemed. But before dinner was finished, her phone rang again, urgent, insistent, and she excused herself from the table with an apology that Daniel no longer had the strength to accept. He had spent that Saturday afternoon doing something almost ceremonial, chopping vegetables the way she liked them, setting the thermostat to the exact temperature she preferred, even digging out the playlist from their wedding reception that neither of them had listened to in years. He had rehearsed, quietly, a small speech about renewing their vows to each other, about slowing down, about finding their way back to whoever they had been before. Exhaustion and distance crept into every conversation. When she finally walked through the door, apologetic and visibly drained, some part of him still hoped the evening might rescue itself. That one honest conversation over a home-cooked meal could undo months of growing silence. But watching her rise from the table mid-sentence to answer yet another call, her voice dropping into that same clipped, urgent tone he had come to dread, Daniel felt the last of his hope drain out of him entirely, replaced by a tired, resigned certainty that no amount of candlelight could fix whatever had broken between them. That was the moment something in him finally broke. He walked to the drawer where he had hidden the envelope for nearly a week, debating, hoping he would never need it. And he set it down on the table beside the candles that were supposed to mean something else entirely. He told her, as gently as he could manage, that he thought they were finished, that whatever they had built together had quietly died somewhere along the way, and that letting each other go was the only honest thing left to do. Amara went very still. She did not cry, and she did not defend herself. And for one long, terrible moment, Daniel almost took the words back, almost reached across the table, but her silence felt like confirmation of everything he had feared, and so he said nothing more. She asked him only one question, her voice quiet but clear, whether this was truly his final decision, whether there was any version of that night where he might change his mind if she simply asked him to. Daniel nodded, certain in that moment that certainty was the only thing keeping him upright, and Amara picked up the pen without another word. She signed her name beneath his, folded the paper closed, and rose from the table. She did not slam the door. She did not raise her voice. She simply gathered her coat, kissed the top of his head the way she had 1,000 times before, and walked out into the night without looking back, leaving Daniel alone with 2 glasses of untouched wine and a house that suddenly felt far too large for one person. The phone rang less than 3 hours later. A man's voice, formal and careful, asked whether he was speaking with the husband of Amara Johnson, and Daniel, still raw from the evening, answered flatly that he was not her husband anymore, that the papers had already been signed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that carries more weight than words, before the man thanked him and hung up without explanation. Daniel thought little of it that night, assuming it was some mix-up, some clerical confusion tied to whatever job Amara had never fully explained to him. He went to bed with the papers still sitting on the kitchen table, and he did not yet know that the ground beneath his entire life was about to shift. By morning, the story was everywhere. Every screen he passed carried some version of the same headline, announcing that the granddaughter of Harold Johnson, founder and chairman emeritus of one of the largest corporations in the country, had officially stepped into full control of the empire her family had spent generations building. Daniel stood frozen in front of the television in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his apartment, coffee cooling in his hand, as the camera cut to a woman standing at a podium in a tailored navy suit, her chin lifted, her voice calm and commanding as she addressed a room full of reporters. It was Amara. It was unmistakably Amara, the same woman who had worn second-hand sweaters and clipped coupons and slept beside him every night for 5 years without once mentioning that her last name carried more weight than entire nations. Daniel's cup slipped from his hand, and he did not even notice the sound it made when it hit the floor. He stood there, long after the segment had ended, and the anchors had moved on to unrelated news, staring at his own reflection ghosted faintly across the screen, trying to reconcile the woman he had watched, sign a coffee cup order every morning with the woman who had just addressed a room full of financial reporters without a single tremor in her voice. Strangers around him murmured about the announcement, some impressed, some skeptical of a company so suddenly handed to someone so young, and none of them had any idea that the man standing frozen among them had shared a bed with that same woman only 12 hours earlier. Daniel walked out of the coffee shop without finishing his drink, his legs carrying him nowhere in particular, his mind replaying every strange absence and hushed phone call of the last several years, each one now rearranging itself into a shape he had never once considered. He thought of the divorce papers still sitting folded in his coat pocket, the ink barely dry, and felt something cold and enormous settle in his chest, the unmistakable sensation of having made an irreversible decision based on an incomplete story. The truth, when it finally unraveled, reached further back than Daniel could have imagined, all the way to a childhood spent behind estate walls Amara barely remembered as home. She had been the only grandchild of a family whose fortune stretched across continents, raised under the constant, exhausting awareness that every person who smiled at her might be smiling at her name rather than her face. Her grandfather, a man both loving and severe, had warned her early and often that if she ever wanted to know what real love felt like, she would have to earn it in disguise, because no one offered honesty to a woman who could change their entire future with a signature. And so Amara built a life in the shadows of her own fortune, working ordinary jobs under a shortened version of her name, determined to find someone who wanted nothing from her but her company, never imagining how deeply that same secret would one day wound the very man she had chosen. She remembered, even now, the exact age she first understood what her last name meant to strangers, 7 years old, standing beside her grandfather at a charity gala, while grown adults competed for her attention with a desperation that unsettled her, even as a child. She remembered the string of tutors and companions hired throughout her adolescence, each one paid handsomely to spend time with her, each one leaving her privately wondering whether any affection in her life had ever been entirely free of a paycheck somewhere behind it. By the time she was old enough to make her own choices, Amara had already decided that if she ever wanted to be loved honestly, she would have to become someone else first, someone ordinary enough that no one would think to look twice, and it was that decision, made years before she ever set foot behind a coffee counter, that eventually led her into Daniel's life, wearing a name that was only half her own. Every disappearance Daniel had questioned, every late night, every hushed call taken behind a closed door, had a name and a reason he had never been permitted to know. The trips he assumed were unexplained absences were emergency board meetings, called in the middle of the night when markets shifted or leadership crises threatened to collapse divisions employing tens of thousands of people. The calls that pulled her away from dinner were not distractions from their marriage, but desperate attempts to hold together a company whose missteps could ripple through entire communities, costing ordinary families their homes and their livelihoods. The cars waiting quietly on the corner belonged not to strangers, but to her own security detail, kept at a careful distance, because she had begged them, again and again, to let her walk the last stretch home like a normal woman, returning to a normal life. She had carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders every single day, and she had done it while trying, with everything she had, to protect Daniel from ever feeling like a passenger in his own marriage. There had been one particular winter, Daniel would later learn, when a factory closure threatened to leave nearly 3,000 workers without income just weeks before the holidays, and Amara had spent 11 consecutive nights negotiating with regional officials and union representatives to keep the doors open, sleeping only a handful of hours between calls, never once mentioning the crisis to him, beyond a tired excuse about a demanding new client. Another time, a cyber attack targeting the company's financial systems had pulled her out of bed at 3 in the morning, forcing her into an emergency response that lasted nearly 72 hours straight, all of it hidden behind the same vague explanation of work running late. She had made these sacrifices silently, repeatedly, choosing again and again to protect thousands of strangers' livelihoods, while allowing her own husband to believe she simply cared less than she used to, because the alternative, in her mind, was risking the one relationship in her life, untouched by the complications of her name. Daniel went looking for answers, the only place he knew to look, at the small downtown office of his oldest friend, Ethan Brooks, a lawyer who had stood beside him at his wedding, and who, it turned out, had known the truth for years, under strict confidence. Ethan did not gloat, and he did not scold him, though Daniel could see in his face that some part of him wanted to. Instead, he told Daniel something that broke him completely, that Amara had spent the last several months quietly drafting the paperwork to transfer a significant share of her holdings into his name, planning to do it the moment she finally stepped back from daily operations, so that no matter what happened between them, he would never again have to work himself into exhaustion just to feel secure. Daniel sat in stunned silence, understanding for the first time that every ounce of distance he had resented had been an act of protection rather than betrayal. Ethan explained, carefully and without judgment, how the secrecy had never been Amara's preference so much as her inheritance, passed down through a family that had learned the hard way what happened to those who let their fortune become public knowledge too early in a relationship. He described boardroom battles Daniel had never heard about, hostile bids from rival conglomerates that Amara had fought off in private, entire divisions she had personally saved from collapse during nights Daniel had assumed were nothing more than unexplained absences. Ethan admitted that he had wanted to tell him the truth more than once, especially in recent months as the strain between them grew visible even to outsiders. But he had promised Amara his silence years earlier, back when she first confided in him during the early, terrified days of their courtship. And a lawyer's word, he said quietly, was not something he could break even for a friend he loved like a brother. Daniel absorbed every sentence like a blow he had not braced for, each one dismantling a little more of the narrative he had built for himself over the past year, until nothing remained standing but the plain, devastating truth that he had walked away from the very woman who had spent 5 years trying to shield him from a burden she carried entirely alone. He went home that night and did something he had never allowed himself to do in 5 years of marriage. He searched through the drawer where Amara kept her old letters, the ones she wrote by hand and never sent, tucked beneath folded scarves and expired coupons she had never actually needed. Each one carried some version of the same confession, written in her careful handwriting, apologizing for the lies of omission, for the missed dinners, for the version of herself she had been forced to hide even from the man who slept beside her every night. One letter, dated nearly 2 years earlier, admitted that she was terrified he would only ever see the fortune and never the woman standing behind it, and that terror had cost her the one thing she wanted more than any inheritance, his uncomplicated trust. Daniel sat on the floor of their now half-empty apartment and wept for the first time since the divorce, not for himself, but for the years she had spent carrying that fear entirely alone. He read every letter twice, some 3 times, tracing the small imperfections in her handwriting, where the pen had pressed too hard or trailed off mid-sentence, as though she had stopped herself before writing something even she was not ready to admit. One letter described a night early in their marriage, when she had almost told him everything over dinner, the words sitting right at the edge of her tongue, before a phone call about a failing subsidiary in another time zone pulled her away, and the moment passed and never quite returned. Another, shorter and more fragile than the rest, simply read that she hoped one day he would understand that her silence had never been about protecting a fortune, but about protecting the only relationship in her life that had nothing to do with money at all. Daniel folded each letter back exactly as he had found it, as though careful handling might somehow undo the damage of never having read them sooner, and he sat in the quiet apartment until the streetlights outside flickered on, finally understanding the full shape of what he had lost. He arrived at the Johnson Corporate Tower 3 days later, a building he had walked past 100 times, without ever imagining his own wife's name, etched somewhere inside its foundation. Security escorted him through marble lobbies and past rows of employees, who straightened at the mention of who he had once been to the woman upstairs, and Daniel felt, for the first time in his life, entirely out of place, in a world that had apparently belonged to his own household all along. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, Amara stood waiting near the window in a gray suit that fit like armor, her posture composed, her expression unreadable in a way he had never seen from her before. This was not the woman who used to fall asleep against his shoulder on the couch. This was a chief executive who had learned, likely long before he ever met her, how to keep her face perfectly still while her heart did something else entirely. The office around her seemed to swallow him whole. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a skyline he had spent his entire career trying to leave his own mark on, framed photographs of factory openings and charitable groundbreakings lining walls he had never known existed. Daniel noticed, on the corner of her desk, a small chipped mug, shaped like a coffee cup, identical to the ones from the shop where they had first met. And something in his chest twisted at the realization that she had kept it there the entire time, tucked among binders worth more than most people's homes. He wanted more than anything to ask her why she had never simply told him, why she had let him believe for 5 years that they were building something modest and equal, when in truth she had been shielding him from a burden the size of an entire nation's economy. But the words would not come easily in that room, surrounded by evidence of a life so far removed from the small apartment he still called home. And he understood, standing there, exactly how frightening honesty must have felt to a woman who had spent her whole life being loved for the wrong reasons. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, though it felt to Daniel like the longest exchange of his life. He apologized, clumsily at first, then more plainly, admitting that he had let suspicion write a story that was never true, that he had mistaken her sacrifice for indifference because it was easier than sitting with uncertainty. Amara listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him quietly that he did not owe her anything, that the papers were already signed, and there was no version of the law that required him to explain himself further. But Daniel saw something flicker behind her composure as she said it, a tightness at the corner of her eyes that no amount of practiced calm could fully hide, and he understood that her forgiveness, if it ever came, would not arrive quickly or easily, and that he had no right to demand it. He left the building that day having decided not to chase her, not because he had stopped caring, but because he finally understood that love built on guilt was no love at all. Instead, he threw himself into his work with a focus he had never allowed himself before, taking on ambitious projects, staying later than even his most driven colleagues, determined to build something that was entirely his own, untouched by anyone's fortune but his own effort. Slowly, quietly, his name began appearing where it never had before, attached to public buildings and award nominations and interviews in industry magazines that once would have seemed impossibly out of reach. He did not do it to win her back. He did it because, for the first time in years, he needed to know who he was when nobody else's shadow was standing over him. Nearly a year passed before their paths crossed again, and when they did, it happened somewhere neither of them expected. On the site of a major public infrastructure project, commissioned in part by the very corporation Amara now led. Daniel's design had been selected months earlier through a blind review process, his firm's name chosen entirely on merit, with no one on the committee aware of any connection to the woman signing off on the final approvals. When he walked into the boardroom and saw her seated at the head of the table, both of them froze for a heartbeat before settling into something steadier, something closer to equals, meeting for the first time without secrets standing between them. There was no fortune separating them in that room anymore. No hidden identity waiting to collapse everything. Only two people who had built themselves back up from very different kinds of ruin, meeting now on entirely level ground. The meeting itself proceeded with a professionalism that surprised everyone present. Daniel presenting his design with the same steady confidence he brought to every pitch, Amara asking sharp, thoughtful questions about sustainability and community impact, without ever once letting her tone slip into anything personal. Colleagues on both sides of the table noticed nothing unusual, unaware that the architect and the executive negotiating terms across from one another had once shared a wedding, a small apartment, and 5 years of a life neither of them spoke about within those walls. Only when the meeting adjourned and the room slowly emptied did the two of them linger near the window for a moment longer than necessary, exchanging a brief, careful conversation about nothing in particular, the kind of small talk that carries far more meaning between two people who once knew each other's every habit. Daniel left the building that afternoon, feeling, for the first time since the divorce, something other than regret, a fragile but undeniable sense that perhaps the story between them was not yet finished being written. It was Harold Johnson who finally told Daniel the piece of the story no one else had dared to share, inviting him to the family estate for a quiet conversation neither man had planned in advance. The old man admitted, with more gentleness than Daniel expected from someone so famously guarded, that Amara had once come to him prepared to walk away from the entire inheritance, ready to sign away her claim to the company just to live an unremarkable life with the man she loved. Harold had refused to let her do it, not out of greed, but out of conviction, telling her plainly that if she could not learn to protect the tens of thousands of families depending on that company, then whatever love she chose instead would always be incomplete, built on a foundation of people she had abandoned. Daniel sat with that truth for a long time, understanding at last that Amara had never chosen the company over him. She had simply chosen to be a whole person, rather than half of one, and he had punished her for it without ever asking why. Harold poured them both a drink neither man finished, and spoke slowly, as though each memory cost him something to retrieve. He described the day Amara first told him she had fallen in love with a young architect who had no idea who she truly was, how her eyes had lit up in a way he had not seen since she was a child, and how frightened she had been even then that the truth would eventually cost her the one uncomplicated happiness she had ever known. He told Daniel that watching his granddaughter navigate those years had been one of the hardest things he had ever witnessed, prouder of her strength than he could put into words, yet aware every single day of the loneliness she carried behind her composure. Before Daniel left the estate that evening, Harold placed a hand on his shoulder and told him, without any trace of bitterness, that it was not too late to become the kind of man worthy of the sacrifice she had made, provided he was finally willing to see her clearly, in full, rather than in the fragments fear and assumption had once allowed. He apologized to her one final time, not to win anything back, but because it was the only honest thing left to give her, and he told her clearly that he would not pressure her toward a reconciliation she did not want, that her peace mattered more to him now than his own longing. Something in Amara softened when she heard him say it, not because the words were new, but because for the first time they came without any expectation attached, without any quiet hope disguised as generosity. She realized, watching him stand there asking for nothing, that the man who had once signed divorce papers out of fear was slowly becoming someone capable of loving her without needing to control the shape of that love. It did not fix everything overnight, but it planted something between them that neither of them had felt in a very long time, something that resembled trust, beginning to grow back from bare ground. Months later, Amara reached out to Daniel herself, inviting him to the opening ceremony of a community center his firm had designed, funded in part by a foundation the Johnson family had quietly established years earlier. He arrived not knowing what to expect, and found her waiting near the entrance in a simple dress, her security kept respectfully at a distance. Looking for the first time in over a year, like the woman he had fallen in love with behind a coffee counter, rather than the executive who ran an empire. After the ceremony ended, and the crowd thinned, the two of them walked together without any particular destination in mind, and somehow, without either fully deciding it, their steps carried them to the same small restaurant where they had married 5 years earlier, its folding chairs replaced now, its candles different, but its warmth somehow unchanged. Daniel reached into his coat and drew out the wedding ring he had never been able to part with, the one he had carried in his pocket through every long night of the past year, through every project, every apology, every quiet hope he refused to admit out loud. He told her he was not asking her to forget anything, and he was not asking her to forgive him on any schedule but her own, only that if a day ever came when she felt ready to trust him again, he intended to spend the rest of his life proving that he had learned to listen before he judged, to ask before he assumed, to stay before he ever considered walking away again. Amara said nothing for a moment, simply reached into her own bag and drew out a ring of her own, one she had never once thrown away despite everything, despite the papers and the silence and the year that had passed between them. They slid the rings back onto each other's hands quietly, without ceremony, without an audience beyond Harold, who stood a respectful distance away with tears he did not bother hiding, and a handful of people who had watched their story unfold from somewhere close enough to understand what it had cost them both to arrive at that moment. There were no cameras, no headlines, nothing resembling the spectacle that had once torn their private life open for the entire world to witness. There was only a man and a woman standing in the same restaurant where they had first promised themselves to one another, choosing, deliberately this time, to try again with nothing hidden between them. Amara reached for his hand and told him, in a voice steadier than he expected, that she did not want promises about the future, so much as small, consistent choices in the present, the kind of choices that build trust one ordinary evening at a time, rather than one grand gesture. Daniel agreed without hesitation, understanding at last that love was never meant to be a single decision made once and never revisited, but a practice repeated daily, through honest conversations and patient questions, rather than assumptions left to fester in silence. Harold watched the two of them from across the room, remembering the frightened young woman who had once sat across from him, convinced that no one could ever love her without wanting something from her fortune, and felt, for the first time in years, that he had finally been proven wrong in the best possible way. The restaurant staff, unaware of who the couple truly was, simply saw two people laughing quietly together over untouched dessert, unremarkable in every visible way, which was exactly the kind of ordinary happiness Amara had spent her whole life fighting to protect. They walked out together into the evening air, hands laced the way they had been on their very first night together, back when neither of them carried any secrets heavy enough to bury a marriage. This time, there was no fortune standing quietly behind one of them, no silence waiting to be misread as indifference, no envelope hidden in a drawer waiting to end everything on an anniversary meant for celebration. What remained instead was something far more durable than money or title, a hard-won understanding that a marriage cannot survive on assumptions, that love requires the patience to ask before it condemns, and that the truest wealth either of them had ever known was not measured in figures on a balance sheet, but in the simple, stubborn choice to stay and truly see one another, even after everything had nearly been lost.